What's up, everybody? Read the title and add your own conjecture if you like. I want to create this ongoing conversation. It's really tough sometimes to communicate via comment section because there's a weird miscommunication that happens with anything that is controversial regarding boxing. You can't even have a conversation about a potential fight at a different weight class without one side of people accusing you of being a, excuse maker for that fighter. So that's not what this is. I want to talk about a couple articles that are, the biggest one that's trending after this weekend. I know you guys in America, it's still Sunday, but it's Monday morning here in Sydney, and these YouTube lives are kind of like my Monday morning quarterback to talk about the biggest headlines. And on this channel, documenting Spence Crawford, we know that Errol has activated the rematch clause. Depending on what news source you guys go to, you'll hear one side talking about how it's a good move. You'll hear another side talk about that it's a bad move. And then sometimes there's neutral topics. But what I want to speak about is the 7-pound, the weight class change. The first fight took place at 47, and it's not documented yet, but rumor is this one is going to take place at 54. And this 7 pounds is a big difference if we're doing anything. If we're doing, hitting the heavy bag. If, you're walking to the store, add 7 pounds into your backpack and see what that does. So I wanted to talk about, who does that favor? Does that favor the bigger guy or the smaller guy? Does that favor the guy who relies on speed or the guy who relies on power? Does that favor psychologically the one who won the fight or the one who lost the fight? And that's the crux of this chat. It has nothing to do with me saying I cheered for Errol Spence in the first fight and he lost because of this, or I cheered for Bud in the first fight and he won because of this. I watched that fight from a neutral perspective, just as I'm going to watch this fight from a neutral perspective. So all of you commenters who think that just to have a conversation about the weight doesn't mean I'm making excuses. It won't affect Crawford. That we would think so. Now, why do you say that? Will it not affect Crawford because he simply won the first fight? Because from a statistical perspective, the only guarantees are this. Neither guy has ever fought in the pro levels at 54. You know what I mean? And that's the whole conversation to talk about, is how can we just say for sure? Let's remove the last fight. Let's remove how that went down. Even if that fight would have been a first-round KO. I mean, have you guys thought about if EJ would have got sparked in the very first exchange, which never happens in boxing, happens more in the UFC. But let's say EJ gets starched in the first round of the first fight and he still activates the rematch clause. I mean, what would the perception be versus him taking the beating, showing that he could take it, because the body actually is more closer to 54 than 47 at this time? What I mean, though, is when we think about the 7 pounds, there's other variables that go into that on fight night. There's weight cutting, there's hydration, there's tactics. I mean, the one thing that we have to say, depending what side of the camp you're on, is Errol's tactics must change. And we'll do that on another chat. He must, leaning in on Bud and, expecting your footwork to be classier than Bud Crawford's isn't going to get it done. He's just going to keep circling you and then he's going to counter you. But this is about the weight. Now, does Crawford have to, he won't admit it, but I heard he walks around, his walking weight is only generally around 160. And Errol Spence Jr. is more like 180, 185. There's been camps. Guys, look at a couple camps ago, maybe 3 years ago. Errol was on an interview saying he was at 192. And the reason, and we know he fought heavier in the amateurs. He walks around 160, so he won't have to cut much weight. And Crawford, this time, he'll be fine. I know for sure. Now, good point, but the whole I know for sure thing, that's still conjecture. That's not how, if you guys follow the channel, nobody knows for sure. We don't know how it's going to happen. I want to hear tactics. I want to hear, I get your point. If he's already walking around 60 and the fight's 54, then the variable of Bud being drained is removed. So that's your point, and that's a valid point. Now, Fighting with a weighted vest on, though, being able to predict gas tank, that's another thing. Pacing in a fight is very important for a fighter's style and technique. That's why this is going to be interesting to see what happens, because neither guy has experience with that pace. Neither guy could say, hey, in the third round, I feel this way. In the fifth round, I'll turn it on, because they've never carried themselves at that amount of weight for that amount of time. That in itself is why I think it's intriguing, because once variables change from a scientific perspective, if you think about this scientific equation, you have to create a hypothesis before you test the theory, right? And then you get a result. With this, we've removed the hypothesis of we know what's going to happen, because the variables at a weight class that's never happened. I knew Crawford would win the first fight in the fashion that he did. Rather, it sounds, how did you know? There's no way you knew. So did you put your house on it? I mean, tell me why you knew. Nobody knew how that was going to play out, mate. But I'm interested, because if you know how that's going to play out, you need to tell me how Canelo Charlo's going to play out. You need to tell me how this weekend in Sydney, how Israel Adesanya versus Sean Strickland's going to play out. And you'll be my go-to guru when it comes to sports betting, because there are no, we knew because of fight styles. Okay. I've watched Crawford for years too as well. But I mean, that in itself, you could, so you guys are fans of Crawford's, and who isn't? If somebody isn't a fan, they're just a hater. And that's not what this is. I'm a fan of Crawford too, obviously. Love his style. But everything we had seen up until this point, we don't have a time machine. We can't go to July 28th. We can't, the night before the fight, we can't say how we felt about Errol. Errol was destructive. I mean, and the thing about Errol is, it's not like, the difference with Errol and Bud leading up to the fight is Bud made everybody look average. Errol had been in some dog fights. Errol got tested multiple times. The Kell Brook fight wasn't a walkover, and because of that, you saw a guy who knew what it was like to be tested, not just with one shot, tested in the corner, tested with his corner telling him, hey, mate, you're not winning this fight. You have to come from behind to win this fight. And we saw Spence do that before, and I think because of that, in a lot of people's heads, it was like, what's going to happen? EJ sloppy footwork, drops his backhand. Yep, I talked about this. Movement pretty, all that good stuff. But the side, what did the media say? What did all the mainstream? Errol's bigger. They even said Errol was more technical, which, look, what I always tell people who want to learn boxing, I always say, boxing is complex due to how simple it is. The simplicity in the technique of boxing makes it complex, because it is very, it takes years and years of practice to keep things tight, to keep things here. When the world's falling down, when there's chaos, to still stay technical, that's difficult to do. Now, to say Errol his technique is flawed, I think it's more that Errol's technique is basic. He's not gonna pretty boy Josh Kelly you. He's not going to reflex fight you with his hands down and make you miss. He's going to take one to give one, and he's the first to tell us that. So I don't think that it's his technique. I think it's more about his tactics. We knew Bud was going to box the shit out of the hype job. Been watching box. I mean, we've all been watching box. You can't, there's no knowing. You guys are crazy. Now, you were cheering for that to happen, and you were right, and kudos, because Bud fought his ass off, but there's no way you knew. There's no way you knew. You know what I mean? And it would just be like, if Errol wins a rematch, there's no way whoever picked Errol is going to say that they knew. It's just sometimes you have off nights. I boxed, dude. Yeah, we all box, man. I coach boxing. It's not just because I know a lot of boxers who are shit coaches, though. So it's not like just because you box, you know what I mean? Some of the worst coaches I know are former high-level boxers. Come down to my boxing gym in Sydney, and I'll show you guys. Be like, that dude was in the Olympics, and he's a terrible coach. So that's not reasoning to say that you knew Bud was going to beat EJ. Let's talk about the weight. We haven't even got to the weight. Why? So the one point I'm going to agree with you guys on is you picked 8th round Brutals. All right, then show me the money, baby. So now you're picking fighters to win by fashion, by round. You guys better be all living in mansions. Shit, you guys better come visit me down in Sydney, and you pay for the flights. But so we're the 7 pounds, right? So the reason why that's interesting is because it gives Errol a psychological get out of jail free card, because then Team Spence they can't say that, oh, the fight's in the same weight class. We have to do things totally different. Errol now has that psychological reasoning around how that fight went. He could say, well, I waited years at 47 for Bud. And that's what he's been saying. And for him to know that the fight will be at 54, that psychological get out of jail free card, he could then erase what happened and start over new. So it's going to be interesting. I don't want to hear that Bud's going to win just because he won the first one. I don't think that the 7 pounds is going to be, I don't think it's going to be meaningless. I think the 7 pounds is going to matter. And this will be an ongoing chat. Guys, just because we don't agree on things doesn't mean that we don't get along. I appreciate the support and all good, valid points. I'm going to go run now, but we'll chat soon. Thanks, guys.